I walked into the conference hall and instantly spotted my assigned chair, shoved to the far end of the table by the catering door. Taped to the back was a pristine white label in bold black letters, "Office Help." My stomach dropped as I stared at those two words that seemed to mock everything I'd worked for over the past 4 years. My manager, Dana, was watching me from across the table with a smirk that made my blood boil. She was clearly waiting to see my reaction as coworkers started to notice the label and snicker under their breath. Some pointed subtly, others whispered behind their hands. The entire room seemed to buzz with awkward energy. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but I forced myself to walk toward the chair with as much dignity as I could muster. This wasn't just a harmless joke. This was Dana's way of putting me in what she thought was my place. After months of taking credit for my work and undermining me in meetings, she'd found a new way to humiliate me publicly. The worst part was that I'd planned this entire conference. Every detail, every speaker, every schedule had been my responsibility. Yet here I was, labeled as nothing more than office help. I forced a polite smile, but my hands gripped the back of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. People were exchanging glances around the table, some laughing quietly, while others looked away in awkward sympathy. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dana leaned over to the guy next to her and whispered something that made both of them laugh harder. She wanted this to be a spectacle, a public reminder that despite my title as project coordinator, she saw me as nothing more than her personal assistant. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she watched me struggle to maintain my composure. I could feel my face getting hotter with each passing second. Part of me wanted to rip the label off and throw it back at her, but I knew that's exactly what she wanted. Dana thrived on drama and conflict, especially when she could paint herself as the victim afterward. Instead, I took a deep breath and pulled out the chair. If she wanted to play games, I'd play along for now. But deep down, something had shifted. This wasn't just another one of her petty power plays. This was the last straw. She'd crossed a line, and somehow, some way, I was going to make sure she regretted it. The room suddenly hushed as the CEO entered through the main doors. William Hayes was a tall, serious man who commanded respect wherever he went. Everyone straightened in their chairs as he made his way toward the conference table, his eyes scanning the room with the sharp attention to detail that had made him successful. His gaze landed on me, then shifted to the ridiculous label taped to my chair. I watched his expression change from neutral to something much harder. His jaw tightened slightly, and a muscle in his cheek twitched. The room fell completely silent as he continued to stare at the office help sign. Without a word, he walked directly toward me, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. Every eye in the room followed his movement. Dana's smirk began to fade as she realized something unexpected was happening. This wasn't going according to her plan. Mr. Hayes stopped right in front of my chair and looked directly at me. His voice was calm but carried an authority that made everyone lean forward to listen. "Let's switch seats," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Dana's face had gone completely pale as she realized her little joke was about to backfire spectacularly. The shift was instant and dramatic. Dana's confident grin collapsed like a house of cards as she watched the CEO gesture for me to take his seat at the head of the table. She muttered under her breath, "It's just a joke," but her voice cracked with nervousness. Nobody was laughing anymore. Mr. Hayes had already taken my labeled chair, sitting down with the dignity of a man who had nothing to prove. The office help sign looked absurd behind his expensive suit and commanding presence. He made no move to remove it, letting it serve as a silent statement about Dana's poor judgment. All eyes were on her now, and she couldn't laugh this one off. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Some looked shocked, others appeared impressed by the CEO's bold move. A few were already pulling out their phones, no doubt preparing to share this story with colleagues who weren't present. I walked to the head of the table on shaking legs, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. As I sat down in the CEO's chair, I caught Dana's eye across the table. The look of panic and humiliation on her face was almost enough to make me feel sorry for her. Almost. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. Let me take a step back and introduce myself properly. My name is Lauren, and I'd been working at Meridian Solutions for 4 years at that point. I'd started as an administrative assistant right out of college, working my way up through determination and long hours. Over time, I'd proven myself capable of much more than filing and answering phones. 2 years ago, I was promoted to project coordinator, a role that came with real responsibilities and the respect I'd earned. I managed client relationships, coordinated major campaigns, and had become the go-to person for complex projects that required attention to detail and strong organizational skills. This annual conference was my baby. I'd spent the last 3 months planning every aspect of it, from booking the venue to coordinating with speakers to managing the catering. I'd worked nights and weekends to make sure everything was perfect, because I knew how important this event was for our company's reputation. But here's the thing that made Dana's label so infuriating. She'd been taking credit for my work throughout the entire planning process. Whenever upper management asked about conference details, she'd step in and present my ideas as her own. She'd forget to copy me on emails to stakeholders and would present updates to the leadership team without mentioning my involvement. This wasn't a one-time insult. It was the culmination of months of her systematically undermining me and trying to keep me in what she saw as my proper place. Dana's pattern of undermining me had been going on for months, but it was so subtle that it was hard to call out without sounding paranoid. She had a talent for making her attacks seem innocent while systematically chipping away at my credibility and confidence. In meetings, she'd interrupt me mid-sentence to clarify what I was saying, usually in a way that made my ideas sound less impressive. She'd forget to copy me on important emails, then act surprised when I wasn't up to speed on developments. When I'd present solutions to problems, she'd pause thoughtfully and say, "That's interesting, but what if we tried this instead?" before suggesting almost exactly what I'd just proposed. The worst part was how she'd present my work to upper management. She had a way of describing my contributions that made them sound routine and expected, while highlighting her own oversight and strategic guidance. She'd say things like, "Lauren handled the logistics while I focused on the big picture," making it sound like I was just following her brilliant vision. She liked having someone to do the heavy lifting while she took the spotlight and the credit. I was useful to her, competent enough to make her look good, but junior enough that she could dismiss my contributions when it suited her. This label on my chair was just her latest way of making sure I knew my place in her version of the company hierarchy. After the dramatic chair swap, I decided not to confront Dana immediately. The CEO's public support had already made a powerful statement, and I didn't want to seem petty or vindictive in front of the entire leadership team. Instead, I focused on being composed and professional throughout the rest of the conference. I smiled when necessary, nodded thoughtfully during presentations, and contributed to discussions when appropriate. But in my head, I was already strategizing. Dana had handed me the perfect opening for something bigger than just getting back at her for one humiliating moment. She'd shown her true colors in front of the most important people in the company, and I wasn't going to waste that opportunity. The conference continued, with various department heads presenting their quarterly reports and upcoming projects. I noticed that Mr. Hayes kept glancing in my direction, and when our eyes met, he'd give me an almost imperceptible nod. It was clear that he was paying attention to how I handled myself under pressure. Dana, on the other hand, seemed flustered for the rest of the day. She stumbled over her presentation, forgot key details about projects I'd worked on, and generally appeared to be off her game. Several colleagues approached me during breaks to ask if I was okay, their sympathy genuine, but their curiosity obvious. By the end of the conference, I'd made a decision. This was going to be the beginning of something, not just the end of my patience with Dana's behavior. In the weeks following the conference, I started documenting everything. Every meeting where Dana dismissed my ideas, every project where she tried to take credit, Every inappropriate comment or attempt to undermine me, I kept detailed records of it all. I didn't confront her about any of it. I just quietly collected evidence and built my case. I started keeping a daily log of my interactions with Dana, noting dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes when possible. I saved every email that showed her taking credit for my work or excluding me from important communications. I documented instances where she'd promised to include my contributions in reports to upper management, then failed to do so. The process was methodical and sometimes frustrating, especially when I had to bite my tongue during particularly egregious examples of her behavior. But I knew that if I was going to make a change, I needed to be smart about it. Emotional outbursts and accusations wouldn't get me anywhere. Facts and patterns would. I also started being more strategic about my own communications. I began copying relevant stakeholders on important emails, not to undermine Dana, but to ensure my contributions were visible. I started volunteering to present my own work when appropriate, rather than letting her speak for me by default. The key was to position myself not as someone complaining about my boss, but as someone ready to take on more responsibility and leadership within the organization. I began networking more directly with people above Dana in the company hierarchy. This wasn't about going behind her back or bad-mouthing her. It was about making myself visible and valuable in spaces where she couldn't control the narrative. I volunteered for cross-department projects that Dana couldn't claim oversight of. When the marketing team needed help with a client presentation, I offered my project management skills. When HR was planning the company retreat, I stepped up to coordinate logistics. These opportunities allowed me to work directly with senior managers and department heads, showing them my capabilities firsthand. I also made an effort to build a relationship with Mr. Hayes' executive assistant, Carol. She was a gatekeeper who had significant influence over who got FaceTime with the CEO. I'd stop by her desk occasionally to chat, always professional but friendly. When she mentioned being overwhelmed with organizing the executive team's travel for an upcoming conference, I offered to help with the coordination. These weren't calculated power moves designed to overthrow Dana. They were genuine efforts to be helpful and to expand my role within the company. But they had the added benefit of putting me on the radar of people who mattered, people who could see my work ethic and capabilities without Dana's filter. Slowly but surely, I was building a network of colleagues who knew what I could do and who I really was, beyond Dana's attempts to define me. Dana, feeling untouchable after years of successfully managing up while managing down poorly, started cutting more corners than usual. She'd become comfortable delegating crucial tasks to inexperienced interns and skipping quality checks, confident that I'd fix her mistakes behind the scenes like I always had. She assigned a new intern to handle client communications for a major account without proper training or oversight. When the intern sent out an email with incorrect pricing information, Dana didn't catch it during her cursory review. In the past, I would have quietly fixed the error and saved everyone from embarrassment. This time, I documented the mistake and let it proceed. She also started missing deadlines for her own deliverables, assuming I'd either cover for her or that clients wouldn't notice. When a presentation deck for an important client meeting was due, she submitted it 2 days late with obvious errors in the financial projections. Again, I documented the timeline and kept copies of the flawed work. The pattern was becoming clear. Dana was relying on me to be her safety net, while taking credit for successes and avoiding blame for failures. She'd grown so comfortable with this arrangement that she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. But this time, I wasn't quietly fixing her mistakes. I was letting them stand on their own merit while making sure there was a clear paper trail showing who was responsible for what. The turning point came during an important client presentation that went spectacularly wrong. Dana had been leading the proposal for a major account, a potential 6-figure contract that could significantly impact our quarterly numbers. She delegated most of the actual work to me while positioning herself as the strategic lead. The morning of the presentation, it became clear that Dana hadn't reviewed the final deck thoroughly. Key slides contained outdated information, Financial projections didn't match the client's requirements, and several sections contradicted each other. When the client pointed out these inconsistencies during the meeting, Dana's first instinct was to throw me under the bus. "I'm sorry about these errors," she said, looking directly at me. "Lauren was responsible for the final review, and it seems like some details were missed." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at me, waiting for my response, but I was prepared for this moment. I calmly pulled out my phone and showed the email timeline to our regional director, who was sitting next to me. The timestamps clearly showed that I'd submitted the completed deck to Dana 3 days earlier, and that all subsequent changes had been made by her or at her direction. The client meeting ended awkwardly, and we didn't get the contract. But more importantly, cracks had started to appear in Dana's perfect manager image, and the people who mattered were beginning to see them. 2 days after the failed client presentation, Mr. Hayes called me into his office. I walked in with my documentation folder, not sure what to expect, but ready for anything. His corner office was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive furniture, and walls lined with awards and company achievements. "Have a seat, Lauren," he said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "I wanted to get your side of what happened with the Blackstone account." His tone was neutral, but I could tell he was paying close attention to every word I said. I kept my response professional and factual, sticking to the timeline and documented evidence rather than making personal attacks on Dana. I showed him the email chain that proved when I'd submitted my work and when changes had been made. I explained my role in the project and the responsibilities I'd been assigned versus what had actually happened during the presentation. As I talked, I saw his expression change. He asked pointed questions about other projects Dana had overseen, and I answered honestly, always backing up my statements with documentation when possible. I could see him connecting this incident to the office help label from the conference, and I realized he hadn't forgotten that moment of poor judgment. When our meeting ended 30 minutes later, Mr. Hayes thanked me for my professionalism and attention to detail. "It's clear you take your responsibilities seriously," he said. "I appreciate that in an employee." Over the next few weeks, I started being invited to leadership meetings as a project specialist to share progress updates on various initiatives. At first, Dana tried to speak for me or interrupt when I was presenting, but Mr. Hayes would cut her off with a polite but firm, "Let Lauren finish." These meetings gave me direct access to decision-makers and allowed them to see my knowledge and capabilities firsthand. I'd come prepared with detailed reports, clear timelines, and actionable recommendations. While Dana would focus on high-level strategy and vision, I'd provide the concrete steps and realistic assessments that leadership needed to make informed decisions. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Senior managers started directing questions to me instead of Dana when they wanted specific information about project status or potential obstacles. They'd ask for my input on resource allocation and timeline estimates. When problems arose, they'd look to me for solutions. I didn't gloat or try to make Dana look bad during these meetings. I simply did my job well and let my work speak for itself. But I could see the frustration growing in her eyes as she realized that her control over the narrative was slipping. The people above her were starting to see me as a valuable contributor rather than just her subordinate. The balance of power in our working relationship was changing, and we both knew it. The question was how Dana would respond to losing her monopoly on credit and recognition. A high-profile campaign opportunity came up that Mr. Hayes was personally invested in, a rebranding initiative for one of our oldest clients that could serve as a showcase for the entire company. When the project was announced during a leadership meeting, Dana immediately volunteered to lead it, seeing it as a chance to rebuild her reputation after the Blackstone incident. "I'd be happy to take point on this," she said confidently. "It's exactly the kind of strategic challenge I thrive on." Mr. Hayes nodded, but then turned to me. "Lauren, would you be willing to handle the execution side of this project? I think your attention to detail would be valuable here." I immediately accepted, knowing this was an opportunity to show what I could do on a project that mattered to the CEO. Dana agreed readily, probably thinking she could take credit for the results while letting me do the actual work. She had no idea she was walking into a trap of her own making. From the start, I made sure everything was documented under my name. Every timeline, every communication with the client, every progress report was clearly attributed to my work. I copied Mr. Hayes and other senior stakeholders on major updates, ensuring they could see my direct involvement in the project's success. Meanwhile, Dana focused on what she saw as the big picture work. Strategy sessions and high-level planning that generated lots of meetings but few measurable deliverables. Over the next month, I delivered flawless work on the rebranding campaign. Every milestone was hit on time, every deliverable exceeded expectations, and the client was thrilled with the progress. I made sure to document everything meticulously, creating a clear paper trail that showed my contributions to the project's success. I developed a comprehensive project management system that tracked every aspect of the campaign, from creative development to budget management to client communications. When stakeholders wanted updates, they had access to real-time dashboards that showed exactly where we stood on every element of the project. The client loved working with me directly. They'd send emails praising my responsiveness and attention to detail, often copying Mr. Hayes and other senior managers. They specifically requested that I be their primary point of contact for future projects, saying I was the most organized project manager they'd ever worked with. Meanwhile, Dana missed 2 critical deadlines for her strategic deliverables. She was supposed to provide a competitive analysis and a market positioning framework, but both came in late and needed significant revisions. When questioned about the delays, she blamed them on the complexity of the strategic landscape and the need to get the big picture exactly right. The contrast between our performance levels was becoming impossible to ignore, and I made sure the right people were paying attention to the difference. Feeling her grip on the situation slip, Dana started trying to micromanage me more aggressively than ever before. She began reviewing my emails before they went out, questioning my reports, and demanding explanations for decisions that were well within my authority to make. "I need to see all client communications before they're sent," she announced during one of our weekly check-ins. "As the project lead, I should be aware of everything that goes out under our team's name." I agreed politely, knowing that every unnecessary intervention she made would only slow down her own workflow while mine continued to shine. She started scheduling daily alignment meetings where she'd question my progress and suggest changes that didn't improve anything but made her feel like she was adding value. I attended every meeting, took detailed notes, and implemented her suggestions even when they were counterproductive. The delays these created were clearly documented as coming from her direction. The irony was that the more she tried to control my work, the more obvious it became that she didn't understand the details of what I was doing. Her suggestions often revealed gaps in her knowledge that I had to politely correct. Her micromanagement was actually highlighting her own limitations while showcasing my expertise. I let her exhaust herself with oversight while my actual work continued to exceed expectations and earn praise from clients and senior management alike. The moment of truth came when we presented the campaign results to the board of directors. The metrics were outstanding. We delivered the project under budget, ahead of schedule, and with client satisfaction scores that were the highest in company history. Every slide in the presentation contained data and execution details that pointed directly back to my work. Dana started the presentation by talking about her strategic vision and leadership approach. But when the board members started asking specific questions about implementation and results, they kept turning to me for answers. They wanted to know about the project management methodology, the client communication strategy, and the systems we developed to ensure quality control. I walked them through the detailed analytics, budget management, and timeline optimization that had made the project successful. As I presented, I could see the board members taking notes and nodding approvingly. Several of them complimented the thoroughness of my documentation and the clarity of my reporting. Dana tried to interject a few times, attempting to redirect credit toward her strategic oversight, but the board was clearly more interested in the concrete results I'd delivered. One board member specifically asked, Lauren, can you tell us more about how you managed to bring this in under budget while exceeding quality expectations? By the end of the presentation, it was clear to everyone in the room who had been responsible for the project's success, and it wasn't Dana. A week later, Dana scheduled what she called a leadership review, meeting with senior management to present her proposal for expanding our department's capabilities. She'd been working on this presentation for months, positioning it as her vision for the team's future growth and development. When the meeting started, Dana launched into her prepared remarks about strategic planning and organizational development. But 5 minutes into her presentation, Mr. Hayes interrupted her with a question that changed everything. Dana, this is interesting, but I think Lauren should walk us through this proposal. She's been leading the development work on this initiative. The color drained from Dana's face as she realized what was happening. I had been quietly leading the research and development for this expansion plan, working directly with other department heads to understand resource needs and implementation challenges. While Dana had been crafting PowerPoint slides about her vision, I'd been doing the actual work of building a viable plan. I stood up and began presenting the proposal with all the supporting data, budget forecasts, and execution timelines that I developed. The presentation included detailed financial projections, staffing recommendations, and risk assessments that Dana couldn't have created because she hadn't been involved in the actual planning process. As I presented, Dana tried to interject several times, but the senior managers asked her to let me finish. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and everyone could feel the shift in dynamics that was taking place. I presented the expansion proposal with confidence, backed by months of research and detailed analysis. The plan included everything from budget requirements to staffing needs to implementation timelines, all supported by data I'd gathered through interviews with department heads and analysis of our current capacity. Dana's face grew more strained with each slide I presented. She kept trying to interrupt with comments about strategic oversight and her original vision, but it was clear to everyone in the room that she hadn't been involved in the substantive work. When she tried to take credit for specific recommendations, I calmly referenced the research that supported them. Research she couldn't possibly have done. The senior managers asked detailed questions about implementation challenges, budget justifications, and timeline assumptions. I answered each question with specific data and examples, often pulling up additional documentation to support my responses. Dana sat silently, unable to contribute meaningfully to discussions about work she hadn't actually done. One particularly awkward moment came when the CFO asked about cost projections for new technology systems. Dana tried to answer, but her response was so vague and inaccurate that I had to politely correct her numbers. Actually, I said gently, based on the vendor quotes I've collected, the accurate figure would be, and provided the real data. By the end of the meeting, it was painfully obvious to everyone present who had been doing the actual work and who had just been taking credit for it. The meeting concluded with Mr. Hayes thanking me for what he called my outstanding leadership and thorough preparation. He looked directly at me as he spoke, ignoring Dana's attempts to insert herself back into the conversation. I'm impressed by the depth of analysis and the practical approach to implementation, he continued. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need. He then announced that he was looking forward to seeing the expansion project through to completion, with me in charge of the implementation. Lauren, I'd like you to take the lead on this initiative. You clearly have the best understanding of what needs to be done and how to do it. The silence in the room was deafening. Dana's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to object, but no words came out. The other senior managers nodded approvingly, several of them commenting on the quality of my preparation and analysis. Mr. Hayes then turned his attention to Dana with expression that made my stomach clench in sympathy despite everything she'd put me through. Dana, I think we need to have a separate conversation about your role in these projects. Let's schedule some time to discuss your responsibilities and how they align with the team's direction going forward. It was corporate speak for trouble, and everyone in the room knew it. Dana's face had gone completely pale, and her hands were shaking slightly as she gathered her papers. The meeting ended with plans for me to begin implementing the expansion immediately, while Dana was left wondering what that separate conversation would bring. 2 weeks later, an all-company email landed in everyone's inbox with the subject line, "Organizational Updates." The language was carefully corporate, but the message was clear. Dana's position had been eliminated as part of a strategic restructuring, and she would be pursuing new opportunities outside the company. It was the polite way of saying she'd been fired. The email went on to announce that I'd been promoted to senior project manager with expanded responsibilities for strategic initiatives and team leadership. It mentioned my consistent track record of excellence and proven ability to deliver results that exceed expectations. I stared at the email for a long time, feeling a mix of vindication and genuine sadness. Despite everything Dana had put me through, seeing anyone lose their job was sobering. But I also couldn't ignore the fact that her downfall had been entirely self-inflicted. She'd created the circumstances that led to her dismissal through months of taking credit for work she hadn't done and making decisions that undermined the team's success. The response from my colleagues was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People stopped by my desk throughout the day to congratulate me, and several admitted they'd always known Dana was taking credit for my work, but hadn't felt comfortable speaking up about it. The office help label that had started this entire chain of events seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had only been a few months. The aftermath of Dana's departure and my promotion created a noticeable shift in the office atmosphere. Colleagues who had previously been cautious about praising my work openly were now comfortable acknowledging my contributions. Several people admitted they'd suspected Dana was taking credit for my work, but hadn't known how to address it without risking their own positions. The expansion project I'd proposed was approved by the board with an even larger budget than I'd requested. Mr. Hayes made it clear that this was my opportunity to prove myself in a leadership role, and I was determined not to waste it. I assembled a team of talented colleagues who were excited about the chance to work on something innovative and impactful. The transformation felt surreal, but I was ready for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Mr. Hayes called me into his office on a Friday afternoon to make the promotion official. The conversation was warm and encouraging, very different from the tense meeting we'd had months earlier when I'd been defending myself against Dana's accusations. He explained that the promotion had been a long time coming and that the leadership team had been watching my performance for months. "We saw your potential early on, but we needed to see how you'd handle increased responsibility and pressure. You've exceeded our expectations in every area." The new role came with not just a title change and salary increase, but also equity in the company and a seat on the strategic planning committee. I'd gone from being labeled as office help to being one of the people who would help shape the company's future direction. At the next annual conference, I walked into the same hall where this entire journey had begun. But this time, everything was different. My nameplate was already positioned at the head of the table. No tape, no handwritten labels, just a professional placard that read, "Lauren Mitchell, Senior Project Manager."